I'm tired.
The Late Morning Program with Nam Ras Podcast.
Hare Krishna, everyone. You are listening to the #1 Hare Krishna podcast in the world, the Late Morning Program, with yours truly. My name is Nam Ras Das. I'm here from New Jersey, coming to you live, and I'm here with Sundar Gopal Prabhu, Simon Haas. Sundar Gopal Prabhu, thank you so much for joining me.
Namras, it's such a pleasure, and thank you for having me on your show.
I am so excited to have you on the show. First of all, before we get into Sundar Gopal Prabhu's personal journey and then the topic that we're going to talk about at hand, I just want to give a little shout out to Sundar Gopal Prabhu for his book, Yoga and the Dark Night of the Soul. And if you guys can see that, The Soul's Journey to Sacred Love. A few months ago, I was going through some real difficult times in my life, and someone suggested I read this book. This book really, really helped me. It was just fantastic. It just talks so much about struggle that we might be going through in our lives, in our spiritual lives, in our material lives. And I just want to really thank you, Prabhu. I'm really grateful that you wrote this book, and it really helped me personally. And I know many other devotees have been helped by that. So for all my listeners, if you don't have this book, do yourself a favor. Go get this book. You can even get it for your friends who are, not Hare Krishna devotees, but who are just normal people. They can also benefit from that book. So again, thank you, Prabhu, for writing that book. Fantastic book.
Okay. Thank you for your kind words, Namrasa Prabhu.
Yes, Hare Krishna. So let's get into it. Sundar Gopal Prabhu, I don't know so much about you, but I've heard so many wonderful things about you. Why don't you start off and tell us a little bit about your personal journey, where you grew up, what you were doing until you came to now you're doing a 6-year PhD program and all that stuff. Please tell us.
So, going back to the beginning of this birth,
Yes.
my father, Gauranga Sundar Prabhu, he became a devotee in 1975, just around the time I was born. And this was in Germany. And in Germany at that time, there weren't any facilities, or it wasn't easy if you had a family and you had children. There was no Gurukula. So he had traveled to France to meet Srila Prabhupada. And he saw in New Mayapur this incredible property with a castle and farm community and so many children in Gurukula. And he was completely inspired by that. So when I was 4 years old, we drove. We packed up a car and put a trunk on the roof rack and just moved over to New Mayapur. So I grew up in Gurukul. Let's see, who can I name drop? I'll name drop Manu, whose name now is Manorama. I was in the same ashram as him.
Oh, wow, interesting.
So we grew up together. He's a little bit older than I am. And also the main sannyasi in New Mayapur was His Holiness Indradyumna Swami.
Oh.
And we would have incredible kirtans, incredible prasad. And my personal experience in New Mayapur was a good one. And I to grow up in the countryside like that, surrounded by friends and beautiful deities. Eventually, we moved to England in 1987 and moved to a town called Leicester. And there as well, quite a large devotee community. The temple was run by His Grace Jagat Purush Prabhu. And so his children were there too, and they grew up there. Anapayani, Komala Kumari, you had her on the show.
Yes, of
She
course.
spoke so well.
Yeah.
And so after that, I continued my education there and began to travel to India and spend quite a bit of time there. And in
Right,
the
you wrote
90s,
that in the book, The Dark Night of the Soul, yeah.
in 1991, I went to India and spent some time in the Gurukula there. And that was the time when I met my spiritual master, Srimad Bhaktivinoda Thakura Gosvami Maharaj. And at that time, many devotees from ISKCON were going to see him in Mathura quite regularly, and I would go with them. And in later years, I had the opportunity to travel with him for live with him and travel with him for several years.
Wow.
Helping with his writing. So I would read his handwritten notes and what he would write by hand and type it up in Hindi. And more recently, I've been working on these two books and sharing the teachings of Bhakti in yoga studios around the world. That has led me also to the United Nations, which was very exciting. Sharing the teachings of Dharma at the UN and the dispute resolution division of the UN, giving some workshops there. I then have worked on my master's at the University of Oxford. I'm currently working on a PhD on this particular topic, the svarupa of the Jiva, the ontology of the self.
Fantastic.
That's like a quick summary.
Okay. Very nice. So this has been a very contentious topic, to say the least. I mean, there's many devotees online who are discussing this, sometimes in a nice way, sometimes in a not so nice way. So I just want to ask you, what do you feel? I mean, this all surrounds kind of the podcast I did with His Holiness Padmanabh Maharaj regarding the inherency of the Jiva, which we will get into. Inherency of Bhakti within the Jiva, and we'll get into that. But at first, I want to talk a little bit about controversy, because I asked Maharaj this question also. What is, you feel, the best way to navigate controversy around Siddhanta specifically?
Right. Well, first, I want to start by saying that despite the somewhat provocative title of the episode, right. I'm approaching this not in a way. My intention is not to aggravate the polemic and create controversy and conflict. I think that we live in a world where there's so much division and there's so much conflict. And it's really quite painful to see that in our own devotional or spiritual communities. I've certainly felt that over the years. And I've seen also others, thinking and saying, well, why do the Gaudiyas, there's so many difficulties in the world, so many challenges. Individuals are going through their personal challenges also. Why are the Gaudiyas, locked in debate all the time on various kind of philosophical intricacies that don't seem to really matter to everyday life?
Right.
So in this episode, my aim certainly is not to increase conflict or controversy. My aim is also not to tell anyone what beliefs to hold. I'm very excited about being here today because I want to share some research findings, historical and textual research findings that I feel are potentially groundbreaking and that can really change the nature of the discussion or the debate on this particular issue.
You feel like you can change the debate a little bit on this?
I think it'll change. I think it has the potential to just take it in a different to take it in a different direction and open it up to new considerations. Fascinating. And the way I look at this, controversy in our tradition is, well, I'm reminded of what Srila Jiva Goswami says. He says in Paramatma Sandarbha that the Supreme Lord has a beautiful jewel, a jewel that is, there's no jewel like it. And it has no value. It's so precious, it has no value. Now, some jewels, the jewels of this world, you actually need a light to shine on them to be able to see them. In darkness, you won't see a sapphire or a diamond. But this jewel is self-illuminating. It shines by its own light. And it's the Kaustuba gem. And the Supreme Lord wears that. It has limitless multicolored rays, fine rays that emanate from it. And Srila Jiva Goswami explains that each one of those rays is a jiva. And those jivas are so dear to Krishna, so dear to the Supreme Lord, that he wears the Kaustuba jewel on his chest always and takes it wherever he goes. So reading this in Paramatma Sandarbha, it would be ironic to discuss the topic of Jiva Tattva and to discuss, whether or not love and devotion is inherent in the self and to have like a mood of conflict or enmity with anyone. It's just it's self-contradictory. Wouldn't make any sense.
Right.
If our reading of Shastra is making our hearts harder rather than softer, then there's something wrong with what we're doing.
Beautiful. Yeah. So you think that navigating controversy is that it should be done in a soft, and it should be done in a very sensitive way, as opposed to a way to kind of push on someone's own idea or someone's own whatever maybe someone's own guru might be saying. It should be done in a way that's palatable to everyone.
Yeah, exactly. With deep respect for all jivas, and what to speak of Vaishnavas and Vaishnavis who are described as being the heart of Sri Krishna.
Right.
Also, there's one verse from Sri Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami that's maybe one of the most misused verses, and that's Siddhanta Boliya Chitte na kara alas. So
right.
a lot of people interpret that as meaning don't be lazy about debating Siddhanta.
Right.
But that's not at all what it says.
Really?
Chitte nakara alas means don't be lazy in the mind. And boliya comes from the verb bola, but it's the past participle. And in Bengali, the past participle boliya, it has a very idiomatic usage. It means because of or considering that. So this verse is saying, don't be lazy in the mind just because it's Siddhanta. So the verse appears in Adilila, early in Adilila. And if you remember from Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, there's a lot of Siddhanta at the beginning. So most people just skip over to the Leela, Mahaprabhu's birth and so on. So Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami is saying, don't skip over this. Don't neglect it just because it's Siddhanta. That Siddhanta will fix your mind on Sri Krishna. But that doesn't mean that it's saying, we should go in public forums and start debating Siddhanta, and that's the way to move from Kanishta to Madhyam, and exposure to controversy is the way that we will establish Siddhanta. There's a very particular method in our tradition for establishing Siddhanta, and that's laid out by Sri Madhvacharya in his Katha Lakshanam. So I think most viewers will know the three different types of conversation, which has been discussed previously, Jalpa, Vitanda, and Vad. So Vad has a very particular definition when it comes to Tattva Siddhanta. So Sri Madhvacharya explains, Tattva Nirnaya Mudishya Kevalang Guru Shishyayo Katanyeshu Apisatam Vadova Samite Shubha. So it says here that to understand Siddhanta, it's not a matter of discussion between just anyone and anyone. So like on Facebook in the comment section, it says, Kevalang Guru Shishyayo, between a guru and a disciple, with the sole intent of understanding Tattva Siddhanta. With that kind of conversation is called Vad in relation to Shastra, and it's Shubha. Shubha means it's auspicious. It means that it will yield the desired result. Now, a lot of the when we get into this argumentative mode, a lot of the time it's not Shubha, it's Ashubha.
Yeah.
And we can feel it. We can ask ourselves, do I feel inspired by this? Am I coming out of this conversation feeling like, I want to serve the Vaishnavas more? I want to. So if it isn't doing that, if it's crippling our devotion, it's Ashubha.
Wow. Yeah. So now maybe we can talk a little bit about why is that even important? This question of the bhakti, of bhakti being inherent in the jiva. Why is it even an important thing to discuss?
Okay. To be able to understand that, we need to know the history of the controversy. The controversy is 80 years old. And it goes back to the time when two closest associates, disciples of Srila Bhaktivinoda Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, Ananta Vasudev and Sundarananda Vidyavinod, they left the Gaudiya Math. after the departure of Srila Saraswati Thakur. And they, Ananta Vasudev, who was at that time Puri Maharaj, he gave up his sannyas and became Puri Das and lived at Sri Radhakund. And Sundarananda Vidyavinoda in 1963 or 64, he wrote a book entitled Vaishnava Siddhante Shri Guru Swarup, in which he laid out his criticisms of the Gaudiya Math and everything that he considered to be deviations. And really, the allegation is that the lineage, the Guru Parampara of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada is illegitimate. And the cornerstone argument of that, one of the cornerstone arguments of that is this particular issue. And saying that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur was wrong in explaining that bhakti is inherent in the jiva. Actually, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur doesn't even say that bhakti is inherent in the jiva. He says, so quoting from chapter 2 of Jiva Dharma, Krishna dasyai say bimal prem ataev Krishna dasya rup premi jiver svarup dharma. He actually says prema is inherent in the self. He says servitude to Krishna is pure prema. Therefore, ataev, therefore, prema in the form of servitude to Krishna is the jiva's svarup dharma, or intrinsic nature. So there are groups, Gaudiya groups, who allege that Thakur Bhakti, they may not always say it openly, but they allege that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's lineage is defective for various reasons. They say that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, his presentation on the ontology of the self is apasiddhanta, and it's his own recent innovation. It has no support in Shastra or tradition. And that it is discontinuous with Srila Jiva Goswami and the Caitanya Vaisnava tradition. So it becomes an important topic, partly because of that. But there's another reason also. This is not a side teaching. It's not like some kind of technical point that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is teaching. It's central to his teachings. It's a central pillar of his teachings, as well as of other acharyas afterwards, especially Srila Prabhupada. So Srila Prabhupada writes, for example, Srila Prabhupada writes in Adi Lila, his purport on Adi Lila chapter 7, he says, love of God is dormant in everyone. Right. And if one is given a chance to hear about the Lord, certainly that love develops. Our Krishna consciousness movement acts on this principle. So it's a principle on which the mission of Srila Prabhupada and Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur have been constructed. It's not like, like a little technical point. It's all over. I mean, if you look at Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's books, right from the early 70s, Datta Kaustuba, you find it there, published in 1973. Krishna Samhita, 1979, it's there. Shri Chaitanya Shikshamrita, it's there even much more. Jiva Dharma, it finds its culmination in Jiva Dharma, completed in 1896.
When you say it's there, you're saying the statement that bhakti is dormant within the jiva.
That prema is inherent in the self. That prema is the svarup, or the nature of the self.
The svarup is inherent. Okay.
I want to just clarify my use of terms. I'm using svarup to mean nature, which is how our acharyas mostly use it. So svarup means nature. Everything has a nature. So, bhakti has a nature, fire has a nature, and the qualities or the characteristics, the attributes that form the nature of something is called the svarup lakshana. So the jiva also has a nature, and that's called the svarup. Sometimes svarup is also used to mean siddha deha, but if it's used in that way, you need to make it clear that's how you're using it. So you could say siddha svarup, or you could say siddha deha. So if I'm saying svarup, I mean just nature, intrinsic nature, essential nature.
So I'm not super technical or smart when it comes to this topic, but for like the lay person, So are you saying that, like, for example, our swarup, our identity in the spiritual world, is that what is dormant in the soul? Like, for example, if I am a cowherd boy or something, not to talk about it in a very light way, but because this is a very serious and grave kind of topic, but let's just say for the sake of example, is that swarup dormant in my heart right now, and then or in my jiva, and I can uncover that? Is that what is it saying?
We'll definitely come to that. We'll definitely come to that topic.
Sure.
But I want to say that in particular, I'm focusing here on the question of whether prema is somehow in the swarup of the jiva, inherent in the jiva, I should say.
Okay, so there's difference from what we're saying, because there's like
they're connected. They're definitely connected.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
And we'll touch on that topic
Sure.
when we look at Paramatma Sandarbha and so on. But the main focus is on whether perfected bhakti or prema is the svarup of the jiva. So right. in the way that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura says, he says that the svarup of the jiva is dasya, to be an eternal servant of Krishna.
Right.
And dasya implies prema.
Okay. So is there anything else you want to say regarding the initial question about why is this even important to discuss before we move on to another point?
We could perhaps discuss the presentation of, or an aspect of the presentation of Padmanabh Swami, because
Sure.
that will then also underscore why it's important.
Sure.
So, and this will also be helpful for the audience. Perhaps some who haven't viewed Padmanabh Swami's presentation.
Right.
Padmanabh Swami is basically he is presenting three claims, and I just want to say first of all that although I have some points of disagreement with Padmanabh Swami, I love him dearly. And after his podcast episode, I actually reached out to him, immediately, because he had shared some very personal things about his spiritual journey, and it takes a lot of courage to do that. Yeah. And I consider him to be an incredible Vaishnav and sannyasi, and a real inspiration. And though I disagree on certain points, I always maintain incredible deep respect and affection for him. So I want to
thank you so much for saying that. I think it shows so much about both of you as Vaishnavas, that you're able to disagree on something, but at the same time remain friends, remain respectful, and even show publicly so much affection for each other. So thank you for sharing that, Prabhu.
He actually, I actually asked him for his blessings before coming on this show.
Wonderful.
And he's such a generous Vaishnav that he gave it from his heart.
So please go ahead. Yeah.
So essentially Padmanabh Swami is, if I haven't misunderstood him, he's making three claims. The first claim is that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's presentation on the jiva, on bhakti being in prema, or bhakti being inherent in the jiva, it contradicts certain statements of Srila Jiva Goswami in the Sandarbhas.
Right. And
because Srila Jiva Goswami is the systematizer of our tradition, he takes priority, and we accept what he says as Siddhanta. And what Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is explaining here is against that Siddhanta. So it's not Siddhanta. That's the first claim. The second claim is that Thakur Bhaktivinoda presented this Apasiddhanta for a particular reason, which was as a preaching strategy.
Right.
And the third claim is that this preaching strategy has now reached its shelf life. There's no reason for us to continue using it. Those are the three. If you take a look at what he's saying, that's a brief summary. Okay. Obviously, he presents evidence for some of that, not all of it. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the thing, and I'm going to look at this through the lens of the study of religion. There are, in relation to a particular teaching within a tradition, there are basically four possible responses to it, broadly speaking. And we'll go through them. There's unqualified acceptance, qualified acceptance, qualified rejection, and unqualified rejection. So unqualified acceptance means everyone accepts it. Everyone embraces the teaching. Like Krishna stu Bhagavan Swayam, as explained by Srila Jiva Goswami, everyone in our Gaudiya community accepts that Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead. All avatars come from him. So in other words, teaching X is true. The second category is qualified acceptance. X is true, but it's not as true as teaching Y. So an example of that is Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary to the first verse of Srimad Bhagavatam. Srimad Bhagavatam has such a diversity of teachings. There's Sankhya, Vaisheshika, Vedanta, and so on. And also a Mahapurana needs to have, there are criteria for a Mahapurana. It has to explain certain things. So it's a diversity of teachings. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur he accepts everything in Srimad Bhagavatam. It's the spotless Purana. But he creates a hierarchy of teachings. Some teachings, they're more illuminating than others. And the highest teachings contain more rasa. And so he creates a hierarchy, and some teachings are more important. They have greater significance than others. The next category is qualified rejection. X is not true. Teaching X is not true, but there was a legitimate reason for its dissemination. So an example of that is Shankaracharya teaching Advaitavad. So Shankaracharya is Mahadev, Lord Shiva. He presented a teaching that's not true. That's what we accept in our tradition. It's not a true teaching, but he did it for a legitimate reason, which was to bring back faith in the teachings of the Vedas, especially the Upanishads. And Buddha, Lord Buddha is another example of that category. And then the last category is unqualified rejection. X is not true, and there's no legitimate reason for its dissemination. So what you have here is a teaching we've grown up with. Devotees have, in their spiritual life, they've grown up with this teaching that bhakti is inherent. You see it all over Srila Prabhupada's teachings. You know that famous explanation of the Maha Mantra? As living spiritual souls, we are all, by Srila Prabhupada, we are all originally Krishna conscious entities.
Yes.
But due to our association with matter from time immemorial, our consciousness is now polluted by material atmosphere. And a little bit later, it's the potency of that, of Srila Prabhupada's words. It's like, you can hear his conviction. And he says a little bit later, Krishna consciousness is not an artificial imposition on the mind. This consciousness is the original energy of the living entity. By hearing this transcendental vibration, this consciousness is revived. It's just like, so you have a teaching that we've all placed in category 1. We accept it without qualification. And now it's being placed in category 3. So it's not true, but there was a reason for disseminating it.
Qualified.
And then it gets demoted.
Qualified rejection.
Qualified rejection. Qualified rejection. But then it gets demoted even further, because the third claim is that there's no longer any legitimate reason for keeping the preaching strategy. It's reached its shelf life. So it gets demoted to the final category, the fourth category, which is unqualified rejection. So you have a teaching that we've always seen in category 1 suddenly plummet to category 4. That will create a response in the devotee community.
Right. I see what you're saying.
It will.
Right. So can we talk a little bit more about the preaching strategy? Because I know a lot of devotees have issue with that.
Right. Okay.
Was it so even if it was or wasn't, maybe kind of from your point of view, we can talk about that.
This is the weakest part. With respect, this is the weakest part of Padmanabh Swami's presentation, because he doesn't. If you're going to make a claim like that, you have to present evidence, and he doesn't provide any evidence. So it remains merely a conjecture. In fact, all of the evidence points in exactly the opposite direction. That Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's presentation on the svarupa of the Jiva was his deeply held conviction and understanding, which he saw as being completely in accord with the teachings of Srila Jiva Goswami. So, in a previous episode, you took a look at, well, we all took a look at. I'm saying we because I watch many of your episodes, Namra. So they're brilliant.
Thank you.
So, Lucien Wong, Lalit
Right.
Madhavpuru, he spoke on the Krishna Samhita, right? So in the Krishna Samhita, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur uses adhunik vichar, which is like a contemporary approach, a modern approach to Shastra. He's prepared to entertain the thought that Srimad Bhagavatam might just be 1,000 years old, because that's what scholars and philologists were saying at the time. But there is a transition in Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's works from his early works before he accepted Diksha and his later works. And of course, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is Nitya Siddha. We accept him as Nitya Siddha. But just like Mahaprabhu, there are stages in the life of Mahaprabhu, from Nimai Pandit to Bhavuk Nimai to Mahaprabhu, the effulgent sannyasi and Sri Jagannath Puri. So also there are stages in the life of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And if you look at the second edition, so Krishna Samhita was published just before his Diksha. So 1879, he completed it. But or around the same time. So, but he completed it a little bit before. Many of the verses of many of the sections of Krishna Samhita were actually composed in the early 1870s when he was working on Datta Kaustuba. But if you look at the second edition of Krishna Samhita, which he published in 1903, I think, he makes changes, important changes. He says this idea that the Srimad Bhagavatam is only 1,000 years old, that's what they think, the scholars and philologists. We don't accept that. He makes that very, very clear. So he's distancing himself from any claim like that. He's no longer interested in adhunik vichar. He wants to present the teachings of Mahaprabhu as they are, without trying to please various scholars. So with this teaching of bhakti being inherent in the soul, that teaching doesn't diminish over time, but it's actually amplified. It becomes more and more. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur speaks about it more and more in his later writings, and it finds its culmination in Jiva Dharma. I mean, that bhakti is inherent in the jiva is the premise of the title Jiva Dharma. Jiva Dharma means the nitya dharma of the jiva, which is dasya and prema. So that's the first thing to understand, that this is found throughout Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's writing. It's in his commentary on Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. Even his very late writings, you'll find this teaching very prominently. So you would expect, if it was a preaching strategy, to begin diminishing, but it actually is amplified. Now, Padmanabh Swami says that the reason, he explained that he thinks the reason this preaching strategy was used is because Thakur Bhaktivinoda was reaching to an audience, the Bhadralok. These are intellectuals, mostly in Calcutta, which was a center of the British Empire in Southeast Asia, and they had a British education and were working in the British administration, many of them. So the idea is that they could not relate or easily understand concepts like anadi, without beginning.
Right.
The soul being the jivas in this world being caught up in samsara from a time without beginning. So he adopted this preaching strategy. But there's so many difficulties with that. Anadi is not a difficult concept, actually. It's not a difficult concept. And you have to remember that the Bajralok, they may have had a British education, but they were Hindus. They grew up in Hindu families, traditional families, most of them. They were well aware of ideas like Anadi. In fact, many from the Bajralok, they found their religious identity in Advaitavad, in Advaita Vedanta. And in Advaita Vedanta, Anadi is paramount. It's an early concept that is emphasized right from the beginning when studying Advaita Vedanta. And then in Jiva Dharma, Thakur Bhaktivinoda introduces the concept of Anadi. So if he was using a preaching strategy to get around or avoid a concept in a book, why would he introduce that concept in the very book that he's using to disseminate a preaching strategy? It doesn't make any sense. Also, if you look in Jiva Dharma, who's articulating this understanding that bhakti is inherent in the jiva? It's articulated by Sri Prem Das Babaji, who's described as being a disciple of Pradyumna Brahmachari, an associate of Mahaprabhu, and also by Raghunath Babaji, who's described as being a disciple of Sri Raghunath Das Goswami. They're described as being Siddha Mahapurushas. Why would they why would they be speaking Adhunik Vichar and Apasiddhanta? It would be tone deaf to the narrative even, because this is one generation after Mahaprabhu that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is describing. There were no British in India at that time, no Christian missionaries. Why would these two personalities, who are described as siddhas, be teaching Apasiddhanta, especially in the section on Dashamula Shiksha? So this is found in Dashamula Shiksha, the essential teachings of Mahaprabhu. Why would Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur introduce as part of the essential teachings of Mahaprabhu Apasiddhanta or use Adhunik Vichar? I could go on for probably a day on this topic. I'll finish with one observation.
Sure.
And this is a question. It's a question, because I haven't seen a response to this. I guess we haven't asked it yet. But in this idea of a preaching strategy, are we saying, is the idea that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and all the acharyas after him, such as Srila Prabhupada, were somehow secretly colluding in this preaching strategy? Or is the idea that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur was using a preaching strategy and acharyas after him, like Srila Bhakti Pragyan Keshava Goswami Maharaj, like Srila Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, were just blindly following? Either way, it's highly problematic. Really, this idea of a preaching strategy it's not evidence-based. So it's actually, what it really is a theological fiction. You want to present a particular understanding of the Siddhanta, but our recent acharyas don't support that. So you come up with a preaching strategy idea as a theological fiction, so that what you're saying is acceptable. But without any evidence, it just remains conjecture.
I think what it goes back to is the quoting of Jiva Goswami's Sandarbhas of why bhakti is not inherent.
Right.
So how can do we know, or are we sure if Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur even was familiar with the Sandarbhas? Oh,
what a good question. Yeah, that is a very important question. As followers of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, we of course say that he is immediately, but some devotees may have some lingering doubts about that, and so it's a question that's definitely worth addressing. Thakur Bhaktivinoda began a rigorous period of study in Jagannath Puri in 1870 onwards. He was stationed in Jagannath Puri, and he began studying the books of our tradition, of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. Now, one reason that this question is an interesting and important one is that nowadays we can easily get almost any text online.
Right.
So, Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita is at a click of a finger away. The Sandarbhas also, and so on. But Thakur Bhaktivinoda actually spent many, many years searching for a copy of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita and wasn't able to find it. So, did he actually have the Sandarbhas? Well, Thakur Bhaktivinoda writes that he himself by hand copied all of the Sandarbhas so that he had his own personal copy of all of the Sandarbhas. And in the 1870s, he was already writing verses in Sanskrit, the verses of Datta Kaustuba and Krishna Samhita. So he had fluency in Sanskrit, and he was studying the Sandarbhas under the tutelage of a very learned Vaishnav named Gopinath Pandit. And Thakur Bhaktivinoda, he was studying so quickly and absorbing this so quickly that the other students who were studying with him couldn't keep up. So there was one student who had previously studied Nyaya in Navadvip, and the other student had previously studied in Varanasi. He had studied Vedanta, but they couldn't keep up. So Thakur Bhaktivinoda was learning and then teaching them in turn. And if you look at Thakur Bhaktivinoda's books, he's quoting the Sandarbhas in many places. I mean, especially Sri Chaitanya Shikshamrita. He's translating large sections into Bengali from the Sandarbhas. He considered Srila Jiva Goswami to be his guardian, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and his inspiration for his own writing. So there's one incident where he became ill from his writing work, overexertion in his writing, as he describes it. He became very ill, and there was no medicine that could help him. And he prayed to Srila Jiva Goswami that, I have to finish this work. Please help me. And immediately he recuperated, and he attributes that remarkable recovery to the mercy of Srila Jiva Goswami. There's a lot of evidence that clearly points that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur was deeply familiar with the Sandarbhas.
Mm-hmm. So, again, going back to Maharaj's presentation, he gave a lot of Shastric evidence from Jiva Goswami about, why Bhakti is what he says. Bhakti is not inherent in the Jiva. So why does Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur explain this topic in a way that seems that it's new and kind of unsupported by Shastra and tradition?
Okay, this is great. Now you're giving me an opportunity kindly to share some of these research findings. That what you've just explained is exactly the point that I had reached when I thought I need to do some research on this, because clearly I thought there's a piece of the puzzle that's missing. Thakur Bhaktivinoda, he's entirely familiar in the Sandarbhas. Actually, one thing, Namrasa, that has come out of this research is just how widely read and learned Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur was. I mean, it's astonishing.
Right.
So, and yet he seems to be presenting in a way that is different to Srila Jiva Goswami, at least apparently. Srila Jiva Goswami doesn't say anywhere directly, Bhakti is not inherent in the Jiva, but he says certain other things that it could be implied that Bhakti cannot be inherent. And Padmanabh Swami mentioned those. So, for example, that Bhakti is bestowed by a Vaishnav.
Right.
That the
main things, right?
That the Jiva is in this world from a beginningless time, anadi.
Mm-hmm.
That if Bhakti is inherent in the soul, doesn't that mean that Bhakti is Svarup Shakti? Doesn't that mean then that Maya is covering Svarup Shakti? And right. So on.
Yes.
Or another one, there are 21 attributes of the soul given by Srila Jiva Goswami. They don't seem to mention Bhakti. So, these various arguments. And we'll come to some of those in a moment. But
Sure.
first, to be able to make this understandable, I need to go a little bit back and explain a few key details about the Sandarbhas of Srila Jiva Goswami. Some devotees, watching this will be fully aware of this. Others, I think many others might not be. So I'll start at the beginning. The Sandarbhas are not difficult. So some people sometimes they have this understanding that they're highly esoteric texts and they're very difficult. Most of the Sanskrit is really not so difficult. Srila Jiva Goswami writes very clearly. Because of the scholastic commentarial tradition, sometimes it's a little bit terse. So meaning that he compacts a lot in a few words and may not. There are certain parts where he'll say the beginning of a sentence and you're supposed to fill in the rest of it. But it's usually quite evident what he's speaking about. The context explains it. Now, what makes the Sandarbhas difficult is that they were written for an elite audience of sastric experts who had deep knowledge of the postulates of Vedanta and who were very widely read. So unless you know the sources that are being used in the Sandarbhas, it's very difficult to understand what Srila Jiva Goswami is saying. An example of that is the end of Paramatma Sandarbha. So the end of Paramatma Sandarbha has our first commentary on Vedanta Sutra. Well, the Srimad Bhagavatam is a commentary on Vedanta Sutra itself, but the next commentary that we have in our Caitanya Vaisnava tradition is by Srila Jiva Goswami himself. And he writes on the first 4 sutras, because traditionally you can write a commentary on the whole Vedanta Sutra, or you can write a commentary on just the first 4 sutras, and that's considered good enough for a commentary. So in that, he relies very heavily on the teachings of Sri Ramanujacharya, the Sri Bhashya. And he'll present arguments from the Sri Bhashya, but he won't finish the whole argument. He'll just present like one part of it. And it's unintelligible unless you've read the Sri Bhashya and you understand what he's doing there, that he's referring to a particular argument that's developed in the Sri Bhashya of Sri Ramanujacharya. So without understanding the sources, it's very difficult to understand the Sandarbhas. Now, Srila Jiva Goswami, he wanted to systematize the teachings of the tradition, but he didn't want it to be his own invention. So he takes great care to rely on authoritative sources. And he uses those sources as evidence. Of course, he then supports that with the verses of Srimad Bhagavatam. Srimad Bhagavatam is his main praman. But he relies on Sridhar Swami, he relies on Sri Ramanujacharya, he relies on Sri Madhvacharya to some extent, and so on. Now, he relies on Sridhar Swami most, because he's the most important original commentator on Srimad Bhagavatam. But in Paramatma Sandarbha, there's an inversion that takes place. He relies more on Sri Ramanujacharya, on the Sri Vaishnava tradition, even than Sridhar Swami. So Paramatma Sandarbha is the Sandarbha that explains the ontology of the self. So he's relying primarily on Sri Ramanujacharya and the Sri Vaishnava tradition. Why? It's a very good question. It's because the Sri Vaishnava tradition have the most sophisticated ontology of the self. So Srila Jiva Goswami is taking the best parts from different places. He's like genius, taking the best parts and putting them together. So the Sri Vaishnava tradition have such a sophisticated system, ontology of the self, that it can withstand the onslaught of all other rival schools, Sankhya, especially Advaita Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta is okay. In Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, it speaks about the dangers of being with an Advaitin, a Mayavadi. But there's a reason for that. I mean, one reason is that the heart is like a crystal. We absorb the attitudes of another person or another school for that matter. But the Advaita Vedanta system is very sophisticated. And, you know, it's often we have like a caricatured version of it. Of you know, Mayavadis, we have like this caricature of it. But if you study it, and someone who studies the writings of Sri Ramanujacharya, Sri Madhvacharya, they have to study the writings of Shankaracharya because they're responding to Shankaracharya, and it's a very sophisticated system. And so you need an ontology of the self that can stand up to the Advaita school, and the Sri Sampradaya have been doing that for centuries. And that's one reason. Another reason is that the Sri Vaishnava Vishishtadvaita system fits very, very neatly with Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva. So it works really well. And another reason is that the Sandarbhas were not written by Jiva Goswami. They were written by Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami.
Wow, I didn't know
And
that.
Srila Jiva Goswami writes that. He says,
okay.
Kopitad bandhavo bhatto dakshina dvija vangshajaha vivichya vyalikad grantam likitad vridha vaishnavai. A certain friend of theirs, meaning a friend of Sri Rupa and Sanatan, a bhatta born in a South Indian Brahmin family, wrote this work after gathering the writings of Vridha Vaishnavai, senior Vaishnavas. And then Tasyadyam Grantanalekam Krantavyut Krantakanditam Paryalochyata Paryayam Kritva Likati Jivakaha. Some parts of the original work were in order, some parts were out of order, and some parts were kandita. Now, kandita means broken, so it means either damaged or missing. Now, after reflection, humble Jiva or little Jiva is rewriting it in proper sequence. And just to be sure, Srila Jiva Goswami includes that statement at the beginning of every Sandarbha, including Paramatma Sandarbha. And it's confirmed also by Srila Baladev Vidyabhushan Prabhu in his commentary to Tattva Sandarbha. He writes, svarupa he writes, Grantasya Puratanatvam Svaparishkritatvam Chaha Kopiti Tad Bandavastayo Rupa Sanatanayor Bandhur Gopala Bhatta Ityartaha. The friend of Sri Rupa and Sanatan that's being referred to is none other than Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami. He wrote the original work, and what Srila Jiva Goswami wrote was Svaparishkritatva, a refinement, an editing. So Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami comes from South India, from a Sri Vaishnava Brahmin family. He comes from Sri Rangam, and so that's the reason that Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami, in gathering the materials for the Sandarbhas and writing the first draft, he relies very heavily in certain places on the Sri Vaishnava tradition. So that's like a background.
Right. I was going to ask how we got, what was this answering this, what you're mentioning right now? Where did that, from the original question, how did we get there? I'm just want to make sure I'm following.
This is like just a foundational understanding.
I see.
That will now lead us to a discovery that is really very important. And this is a set of teachings. Well, we're looking here at the sources that Srila Jiva Goswami uses. Because, and I'll give something away here, the sources that Srila Jiva Goswami uses present the ontology of the self in exactly the same way as Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura does.
When others are saying that it's not the same.
Yeah.
Interesting.
You look at the source of the ontology of the self, and these writings are not in Sanskrit, they're in Mani Pravala, which is Sanskrit, uses Sanskrit vocabulary, but it's the morphosyntax is Tamil, and it has a completely different script. It's in Grantha script, and so it's not accessible so easily to us. But what the source, and we're going to come to the source now, the source texts say exactly the same thing as Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur says that, he uses the analogy of water changing state, becoming ice. And so the nature of the jiva undergoes a distortion. The source text says the same thing. The source text says that the nature of the jiva is dasya, and that implies prema. Only difference is, instead of prema, it uses the term priti, as in priti sandarbha. The same vocabulary, the same analogies. It's astonishing. It's really astonishing. And I want to also, we'll talk about the implications of that. But that's...
So can I just reflect what you're saying, just so I understand? So you're saying that the sources that Jiva Goswami is quoting from are saying something different than what he is saying, but it's agreeing with what Bhaktivinoda Thakur is saying.
The sources that Srila Jiva Goswami is using, they need to be understood as part of Srila Jiva Goswami's explanation. Because Srila Jiva Goswami cannot be contradicting the very sources he uses, and we'll come to that.
Right.
So when you look at the source that Srila Jiva Goswami uses, we find that not only does it match Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, but if it's understood correctly, it doesn't even contradict Srila Jiva Goswami elsewhere. So, but let's go to the source.
Sure.
So in Paramatma Sandarbha, Anuched 19, which is where the Jiva Tattva section starts, there's one very important passage, and I'll just state it because it's significant. We'll look at the Sanskrit. It says, Svarupa Lakshanam Padmotara Kandadika Manusritya Shri Ramanujacharya Matacharya Varena Paramavriddha Shri Vaishnava Sampradaya Guruna Shri Jamatri Muninopadishtam. So it's saying here that the Svarup Lakshana of the Jiva is being explained by one Jamatri Muni, Shri Jamatri Muni. And it describes him first. It positions him as, Srila Jiva Goswami and Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami praise him before mentioning his name. And they praise him very highly. They say, Paramavriddha Shri Vaishnava Guruna. So you know how we had this earlier statement that Gopal Bhatta Goswami gathered the writings of Vridha Vaishnavai, senior Vaishnavas. Here now, Jamatri Muni is being described as Paramavriddha, the most senior or very senior guru in the Sri Vaishnava tradition. And also earlier, Shri Ramanujacharya Matacharya Varena, the best acharya in the thought of Shri Ramanujacharya. After that passage, prose passage by Srila Jiva Goswami and Gopal Bhatta Goswami, you then have 4 verse 1 attributes of the Jiva. So, I won't go through it, but it starts off with Atma Nadevo Nanaro, and it goes all the way down to a quality, an attribute that is called Sheshatva. So these are 21 different attributes, and people have been looking for the sources of this for a very long time. And we now have located the source of those 21 teachings, those 21 attributes. We know where they come from, and it's a work by Sri Jamatri Muni, who's also known as Manavala Mamuni. So I'm taking you on a little bit of a journey, I realize that, and I'm moving quickly, right. But I do think that a lot of the studied audience who are watching this will be familiar with this and will be able to keep up.
Okay.
And I'm moving quickly just because we maybe don't have so much time, and I want to make sure to cover as much as I can. Sure. But if at any point you want to stop me or you think I should explain something more, just tell me.
Sure. Yeah.
So there are 21 attributes, and maybe just to explain some of them. It starts off with Atmana Devo. It explains everything the soul is not. So the soul is not a demigod. Atmana Devo Nanaro, not Naraha. The soul is not a human. The soul is not an animal, not an immovable, like a tree or a mountain. The soul is not not the body. The soul is not the mind. The soul is not the life air. The soul is not the intelligence. It's going through everything that the soul is not, and then it begins to describe these incredible characteristics of the soul. Now, I think that this is something we should all know. What are the attributes of the soul? We know the attributes of the physical body. We know the attributes of our subtle body, our personality, and so on. But the attributes of the soul are just astonishing, and there are 21 of them that Jamatri Muni lists, and then the final one is Sheshatva. So, what's very significant is that Srila Jiva Goswami and Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami, they rely on that list of Sri Manavalama Muni. And then they construct the whole of Paramatma Sandarbha, Anuched 19 to 37, based on that list. So they take each individual quality and they explain it. And they provide praman from Srimad Bhagavatam, each one. So the whole of the ontology of the self is based on Sri Jamatri Muni's teachings. Now, there's a reason for that, and we won't do that in this particular episode. But I want to invite those who are watching to an event on September the 18th, where we're going to look at this in detail. And there'll be a paper. There's a paper, 120-page paper I've written, research paper that I'm going to share. And devotees who are interested, they can study that if they like, get access to it, and they can verify for themselves the integrity of these findings. And it has many more arguments and details and sastric support than anything we're looking at here. This is like just a snapshot.
We can put that in the comments later on regarding that event. That I think is a Zoom call that people can join.
It's a Zoom call.
Right.
Thank you. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, we totally could do that. Yeah.
So, Srila Jiva Goswami relies on Jamatri Muni. Jamatri Muni is a very important figure in the Sri Vaishnava tradition. He appeared in this world about 3 generations before Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami. He's regarded as an incarnation of Sri Ramanujacharya himself. He's also regarded as a manifestation of Anantashesh. And those of you who are maybe in Vrindavan at the moment, if any of you are in Vrindavan or going to Vrindavan, in the Sri Vaishnava temple, the Rangaji temple in Vrindavan, there is a deity of Sri Jamatri Muni, who's also known as Sri Manavalama Muni. There's a deity of him. It's difficult, they often keep it closed, so you have to beg the pujari, and they may open that altar very briefly for you. But there's a beautiful deity of Sri Manavalama Muni. There's so much to say about him. He's not a minor figure as some people have thought. He reinstated the worship in Sri Rangam after the Muslim conquest of South India, which lasted for about 40 years. And the teachings of Sri Pillai Lokacharya, an earlier teacher, would have been lost if it were not for the commentaries, incredible commentaries that Sri Manavalama Muni wrote. So he's a very important figure, and by having identified the source that was used by Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami and Srila Jiva Goswami, now we can understand it. It sheds some light on these 21 attributes.
So just to review, so the Priti Sandarbha, the source of where that's coming from, the quoted source is from that Jamatri Muni.
Paramatma Sandarbha.
Sorry, Paramatma Sandarbha. And you have found those original texts.
Yes, the original text that was used for by Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami for developing that part of Paramatma Sandarbha. Correct.
And so the Paramatma Sandarbha, what's being said there is in agreement with Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura.
Well, when you look at the source text, it sheds light on these 21 attributes in a way that completely accords with Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura. So Sheshatva, that final characteristic, Sri Manavala Mamuni says, that actually is the svarupa of the jiva. Everything else is supporting it. It's important and it's supporting it, but truly the svarupa of the jiva, or the dharma of the jiva, he even uses the word dharma, the dharma of the jiva is Sheshatva. And he says Sheshatva means dasya, and it means pure devotion. He says Sheshatva implies priti, because there's a discussion of whether the eternal nature of the jiva as a servant of Krishna, is it a forced servitude? So you know how Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami says, Jivera Swarup hoy Krishnera Nityadas.
Right.
So by nature, we're a servant of Krishna. Manavala Mamuni explains that this is the eternal nature of the jiva, both in bondage as well as in perfection. So even now, even when we may not be absorbed in Krishna, our nature is to be an eternal servant of Krishna.
Okay.
And that servitude to Krishna that forms our nature is not a forced servitude by the injunctions of Shastra, but it's ragatva. It's spontaneous or natural. And he refers to it as priti.
Okay. And I don't know if you want to discuss this now, but about what I was speaking about earlier, like what my svarupa is that discussed in contact with all of this? Interesting.
Yeah. Srimanavala Mamuni explains the meaning of Sheshatva, and he says all of the moods of devotion, that all of the moods of devotion, they come from Sheshatva. So, and he speaks about reversals. So normally the Supreme Lord is the protector, and we are the protected. But there will be these reversals coming out of love, which comes from Sheshatva, where we might want to protect the Supreme Lord. And all of that comes from Sheshatva. All the different moods of devotion, parental mood, the mood these moods are exemplified by the Alvars and other saints in the Sri Vaishnava tradition. All of those are coming from Sheshatva, and they are part of the nature of the jiva. Manavala Mamuni says that very clearly.
Something that I find interesting, or that I'm grappling with right at this very moment, is that the Sri Vaishnav Sampradaya, or who you're quoting from, is pre-Mahaprabhu. So does that mean when it's like when Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu came and gave his, gave without thinking of the person's qualification, gave them, Mahabhava or all that, or his grace, does that mean that it's only for those who are hardwired into that particular bhava that he came to bestow? So how does that fit in to what the Sri Vaishnav texts are saying?
Well, it's not that so Sri Manavala Mamuni explains that the svarupa of the jiva, the svarupa is lost to the jiva. I'll say a few things, quote a few sections or paraphrase a few sections by Manavala Mamuni, because it'll explain this. So he says that he uses the language of remembering and forgetting. So the jiva in this world, in bondage, has forgotten his svarup. And he says also that he speaks about regaining one's svarup. But then he stops himself and he apologizes. He says, well, the jiva has been in this world in bondage from a time without beginning, anadi. We all accept that. So if I say that the jiva is remembering his svarup or is regaining his svarup, it would suggest that he had his svarup already previously.
Right.
He says, no, don't think that. The jiva has been in bondage from a time without beginning, but that's the experience of it. When the jiva's svarup or nature, true nature, Sheshatva, manifests, then it feels as if one has regained something that is very valuable and that has been lost for such a long time. And he said it feels as if one is remembering something. He's expressing it as in the words of his own spiritual perception, much like Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is. Thakur Bhaktivinoda says, look, language is problematic here. You need spiritual perception. And then he uses the language of remembering, forgetting, and remembering. And so it's not necessarily that nothing is bestowed. I mean, in a sense, you could even say that a pure Vaishnava is giving svarupa Shakti. Svarupa Shakti is moving from the heart of a pure Vaishnava into the conditioned soul.
Right.
But what that does is it manifests, or it allows the Jiva to regain or remember their svarup, even though remember and regain are not accurate words, although they describe the experience of it.
Right. Oh gosh, this is really technical.
And by the way, Manavala Mamuni never says disputes Anadi, nor does Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. They both accept Anadi. The 21 attributes, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Manavala Mamuni never say that the Svarup Shakti is covered by Maya Shakti. They never will say that. And it requires a close reading of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and it helps to understand his sources. His sources, and this is quite incredible, there's strong evidence that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's source is that same text that was used by Srila Jiva Goswami and Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami for their Paramatma Sandarbha. Same source. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, put simply, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Srila Jiva Goswami use the same source, rely upon the same source. Now here's the thing, Namrasa. Someone may say, okay, Srila Jiva Goswami relies on Manavala Mamuni, but he's explaining him a little bit differently.
Right.
You could say, right?
Yes.
You could say he's explaining Sheshatva differently. He's not accepting that part. But if you argue that, you put yourself in a very awkward position. Like, you know that expression, between a rock and a hard place.
Right.
Because Srila Jiva Goswami glorifies Manavala Mamuni, relies on his teachings, uses the same terms, like Sheshatva. And so if you're saying that the most important part, because Sheshatva is the most important part of Manavala Mamuni's ontology. So if you're saying that Srila Jiva Goswami has a different view on that, then it begs the following question. Did Srila Jiva Goswami, as final editor, fail to grasp Manavala Mamuni? Or alternatively, did he deliberately misrepresent him? Neither of those options is satisfactory.
Right.
You know, if you look at this in detail, or any of the devotees look at this in detail, and I'll be sharing a paper on it in just a couple of weeks, and it'll have source texts, and you can, you know, would love for devotees to take an interest and research this themselves. For one thing, it'll, you know, if they come back with additional findings, it'll help my own research, help deepen it and further, because it's a 6-year project I've embarked on. And so, but anyone who looks at this in detail and they look at what Sri Manavala Mamuni is saying, look at that closely. It doesn't contradict Srila Jiva Goswami. They're just saying the same thing in slightly 2 different ways. And Thakur Bhaktivinoda is closely following Manavala Mamuni. So Thakur Bhaktivinoda and Srila Jiva Goswami are saying the same thing, just in slightly different ways. It just requires a careful reading of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. I'll give you an example. I'm currently studying with the Sri Vaishnava tradition with a descendant in the family lineage of one of Sri Ramanujacharya's original disciples, and he's an incredible scholar and follower of Sri Manavala Mamuni. And he explained that so Okay, well, maybe I'll leave this point for a little bit later. But what I want to say briefly is simply that if we look at the teachings of Manavala Mamuni carefully, Srila Jiva Goswami won't contradict his own source. How you rely on a source in that way, and then you present something that is in complete opposition to it. It really just requires a careful reading of Sri Manavala Mamuni, and this teacher from South India has explained to me that traditionally, when you study Vedanta in South India, you first study Nyaya, right? Because the teachings of Nyaya really help you in understanding Vedanta. These different schools, the six darshans, are not independent. They borrow from each other. So one principle of Nyaya is that inherence and locus are not the same. Something can be inherent. It doesn't mean that it's located geographically within that same thing. Locus and inherence need not coincide. If you look at a jiva, if this was possible, imagine it was possible. You separated a jiva. Not possible because a jiva is anu, inseparable. But imagine, you wouldn't find Krishna praying there in a conditioned jiva. No one is saying that if you opened up the Atman, although that's impossible, you would find Krishna Prem there. Krishna Prem is inherent, but locus and inherence are two different categories.
Wait, what's locus again?
Locus is where something is located in geographical space.
So then what's the argument then?
It's silly. It's absolutely silly.
Wait, hold on a second. We're doing this whole episode for so you're saying that repeat the point you just made, because I'm having trouble understanding, because there's no argument if you're saying that if you're opening up the jiva, then the Krishna Prem is not there.
We are used to seeing things through Cartesian lens, a lens of Cartesian space. We have Western spectacles on, and we're looking at this through our own conditioning, educational conditioning. So we think that when we say inherence, we mean it's physically located there.
Right.
But that's not location and inherence are two different categories. I'll speak more about that on September the 18th. September the 18th is a really important day because it's the appearance day of Srila Jiva Goswami in India, and it's the appearance day of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura simultaneously in all countries west of India. So it's a really auspicious conjunction. And so this is like a snapshot of a more in-depth discussion we'll have.
Right. There. And is that going to be like you're going to speak on your own, or is there going to be someone else, other like a panel or something, or just? I'll just be presenting the findings and directing people to the paper that I've been working on. Okay. I would love for a panel. Maybe that's something that's gonna happen in the future. I think there's a lot of work we can do. I'm not actually focused on the theology. My focus at the University of Oxford it's in the study of religion, so it's focusing on source texts, looking at the source texts and seeing what the implications are. I mean, there's a whole it's quite a sophisticated discipline where you're using different methods, adaptive reuse, simple reuse, and looking at, really helpful for looking at what's happening. You know, this is something that I found in my studies, very interesting. You can come across passages where there are quotes from previous sources, but someone today will not even know that they're quoting previous sources. It would have been understood at the time by a learned reader, but today we're just in the dark on these things. Mm-hmm. So, as the host of the show,
could I just add one thing?
Did
you know that a third of Sri Upadeshamrita comes from other? Srila Rupa Goswami is drawing from other sources. A third of Upadeshamrita.
Wow, I did not know that.
Anyway,
so I want to just ask you. So, is the crux of the argument, of your argument, coming mostly from this newfound original text by that Muni?
Partly, yes. There's several texts in Mani Pravala, but also research showing that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur was deeply interested in the Sri Vaishnava tradition, and that he had access to the text. He lived right outside the Jagannath Mandir, the Simhadwara gate, 10 meters away. There's Imar Mat, it's a Sri Vaishnava mat dedicated to Sri Manavala Mamuni. It had a huge library. They worship deities of Sri Radha and Krishna. That mat is now destroyed, but at the time of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, it was the largest and wealthiest mat in Jagannath Puri.
Oh, wow.
And Thakur Bhaktivinoda mentions the text in his writings. The source text, he mentions it, and he also quotes, he also translated one of the Rahasya Granthas of Pillai Lokacharya, the Artha Panchaka. He translates it and he has his own notes. And he published extensively on the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya. It's evident that he knew. He's using the same language. So right. Manavala Mamuni speaks of being Atma Choda, the thief of the soul. So we, the Jiva, we've lost our Svarup and we're pretending to be someone else in this world.
Yeah.
Having lost our Svarup, Manavala Mamuni says it's so lost, we don't even know we've lost it. You could even say it's destroyed. He's just emphasizing how far away we are from our Svarup, our nature, that is. And he says that the Jiva is Atma Choda, a thief of his own soul. Thakur Bhaktivinoda in Datta Kaustuba, beginning of Datta Kaustuba, Atma Choda, end of Datta Kaustuba. He's pleading to the Supreme Lord. He says, Krishna, I am a thief of my own soul. Please chastise me for this misdoing and tie me up with the ropes of praying. So the parallels are just extraordinary. So I'm focusing on historical evidence relating to Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and also textual evidence, that is the source materials, especially one text, but others also, that are composed by Manavala Mamuni, and that are the source of Thakur Bhaktivinoda's presentation, as well as Srila Jiva Goswami's.
So how do we explain the other parts of the Sandarbhas which are saying that it's not inherent? Like, for example, in the Priti Sandarbha or the Bhakti Sandarbha, do we have the source texts of those in the same way we have them as with the Paramatma Sandarbha?
These other passages are simply saying that bhakti is bestowed. They're saying that the soul has been in this world anadi, without a time without beginning. They're saying that they're providing these various statements that are not necessarily in conflict. If you understand Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur through Manavala Mamuni, these other sources, these other statements that relate to a few of the points that I mentioned earlier, which His Holiness Padmanabh Swami brought out in his presentation, they can be reconciled without.
Right.
Yeah.
So if they can be reconciled, then what was the historical, when you said it happened 80 years ago with Ananta Vasudev and Sundarananda Vidyavinod, what was their argument then, if this can all be reconciled?
Well, their argument in particular was relating to the cyclic succession, and they were using that as part of their presentation, but they didn't have. Look, this is basically what's happened. Is the following: Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur read extremely widely, and he deeply learned, and he had access to these sources, and of course, Srila Jiva Goswami had access to those sources through Sri Gopal Bhatta Goswami. But over time, we've lost sight of the sources that Thakur Bhaktivinoda used.
Right.
That's really the reason. Now it's easier than ever to search for sources, because we're an interconnected world. I can take lessons from a specialist in this topic, and who's an extraordinary Vaishnavan scholar, through Zoom. That was never possible before. And
Yeah.
some of these texts, not all of them, I mean, the libraries of India have hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that no one has looked at, and no one knows what they are exactly. So even in Vrindavan, the Vrindavan Institute, if you ever have a chance to go in there, it's just incredible what's there. We haven't even begun to start studying and looking at what's available there. But really, I want to just emphasize that the research work that I'm doing is not focusing on the theology.
Right.
I'm focusing on three things. Well, there are three conclusions that I've reached. One is you cannot say anymore that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura invented his presentation. That's over now. This is not his own recent innovation. This has a long sastric comes from a long and highly respected sastric commentarial tradition. That's the first thing. That's without dispute. The second thing is you cannot say that Thakur Bhaktivinoda's presentation is apasiddhanta. If it's apasiddhanta, then you're saying that Sri Manavala Mamuni is apasiddhanta. You're saying that the Sri Vaishnav understanding of their own Diksha mantras is apasiddhanta. You're saying that Gopal Bhatta Goswami was apasiddhantic because he would have understood Manavala Mamuni in exactly the same way as Manavala Mamuni intended. And you're saying that Srila Jiva Goswami relied upon an apasiddhantic source. So whatever one's position, I don't mind whether someone thinks the bhakti is inherent or it's not inherent. Whatever position you have, you cannot say that Thakur Bhaktivinoda is presenting apasiddhanta. Unless...
Who is saying that?
Well, a book has come out saying it. Anyway, His Holiness Padmanabh Swami is saying it's not Siddhanta, it's against the Siddhanta that's presented by Srila Jiva Goswami. If something is against Siddhanta, it's called Apasiddhanta. Of course, Padmanabh Swami is very well intentioned. He's trying to safeguard, protect the heritage of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura. But we can't say that. You cannot say it's apasiddhanta when you know the sources that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura uses. And the third thing the third point.
I mean, one second before that. I think if we ask him, I won't think he would say that it's apasiddhanta, obviously. But you're saying...
If you could, he may not say it directly, but he'll call it maybe provisional siddhanta. So he used the word. He used the example of a stork story, a stork, right?
Stork,
so,
right.
Say a child asks a mother, where did I come from?
Right.
Mother is not in a position to be able to explain to the child the human reproductive system.
Right.
So, she'll tell the child a story. There was a stork. The stork was carrying you in a basket, and the stork placed you here in front of my home, and I found you, and the child is elated.
Right.
But so it's not the scientific explanation is the human reproductive system. You cannot say that the stork story is provisional science. It's not. It's just not scientific. It's a story, but it was for a particular purpose. So if we're saying that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura was teaching about the Jiva in a way that contradicts what Jiva Goswami is saying, and we're saying Jiva Goswami represents Siddhanta, we are saying that Bhaktivinoda Thakura presented apasiddhanta. Call a spade a spade. That's what we're saying.
I see what you're saying.
And I don't mean that as I understand what Maharaj is trying to do, and it's one approach, but that approach we should be very careful before we begin doing what might be called theological erasure. So obviously, no one is saying that we should strike out passages from the books of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura or Srila Prabhupada, but in effect, we're saying large sections of these books no longer have theological value. They're simply quaint historical vestiges that a preaching strategy that was working in the 1800s, but is no longer relevant today.
Right. I see what you're saying.
I think that we should not take that direction yet. We should see what we can do with Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's teachings by understanding them. Put more energy into deeply understanding Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's teachings. Look at his sources. See how we can reconcile this. And from what I've looked at so far, although I'm focusing on the study of religion, not theology, I don't see insuperable difficulties.
I interrupted you when you were explaining, I think, the third point.
The third point is that it problematizes the claim that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is discontinuous from the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition and Srila Jiva Goswami. That's not something that can be said so easily anymore. The thing about a religious tradition is the following. They're complex. Traditions are complex.
Yeah.
And you have different acharyas and authors explaining and borrowing from different sources sometimes. And it's not helpful to collapse the complexity and lose nuance. Sometimes acharyas are explaining things just in a different way, for a particular purpose. So I'll give you an example. This very topic created a division in the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya. Like the biggest split in the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya is between the Tengalai, Tengalais are the southern school in Sri Rangam, and the Vadakalais, the northern school in Kanchipuram. Now, Manavala Mamuni puts a lot of emphasis on Sheshatva and says Sheshatva is truly the svarupa of the Jiva, the nature of the Jiva. That nature exists both in the state of bondage as well as in the state of perfection. Just it may be manifest or not manifest. Another acharya, Sri Vedanta Deshika, he argues against that. And he was around the same time as Manavala Mamuni, a little bit before. So he argues against that position, which is the position of Pillai Lokacharya and Manavala Mamuni. So there's like some disagreement on the nature of the soul. That then leads many generations later. So in the late 17th century and 18th century, it led to a big division in the tradition, with even competition for temples, control of temples, and so on. But what's significant is that, a few things that are significant. One of them is that Manavala Mamuni and Vedanta Deshika were simply engaged in different enterprises. Manavala Mamuni was, Vedanta Deshika wanted to protect the tradition. So he was like very, in that sense, very much like Srila Jiva Goswami, wanted to make sure that no arguments could be made against it by Advaitins. And he objected to certain statements that Manavala Mamuni makes. Like Manavala Mamuni says that the Jiva's Svarup can be, is destroyed. He doesn't mean it literally, but the Jiva's Svarup is destroyed because it's just so lost to the Jiva in bondage. And Vedanta Deshika says, no, the Svarup can never be destroyed. And they have like they have great respect for each other, and they even quote each other, but Manavala Mamuni quotes from Vedanta Deshika, but they have this disagreement on a few nuances and expressions. Now, Manavala Mamuni is similar to Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He's interested in bringing the Sri Vaishnava tradition all over. He wants to inspire. So he's speaking from his moods. He's speaking from his devotion and his spiritual perception. And so they're engaged in slightly different enterprises, but many generations down the line, that can lead to a whole schism. I think it's very important to understand what is an acharya trying to do exactly, rather than just immediately moving for the theological erasure. Another interesting point is that Srila Jiva Goswami could have picked Vedanta Deshika as a source. It aligns well with the idea that bhakti is not inherent.
Right.
Could have picked Vedanta Deshika, but he didn't. He picked Manavala Mamuni. who places that emphasis on Sheshatva.
Wow. Fascinating.
I acknowledge that these are complex issues, and I want to apologize that we're moving through this so quickly. There may be some listeners who maybe we've lost. I don't know. I hope not. But on September the 18th, we'll continue the discussion. There'll also be a paper if anyone wants to read it, because it's easier sometimes reading this and going over it carefully.
Sure. Yeah, I want to emphasize that September 18th event as well as the paper. If you send those to me, I can put them on the comment section, and we can devotees can access those. Prabhu, is there anything else that you want to any points you want to make before we go to the comments? Because there's over 200 comments, and I'm sure there's some questions in there that someone would like to ask you. There's about 180 people watching, so
I want to say something about what this journey has been for me personally.
Sure, yeah.
So I don't know if any of you have read The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho.
I have not.
It's a short story where there's a shepherd looking for treasure, and the shepherd he sleeps. It's been many years ago since I read that, so I'm going from memory. But he's sleeping in an old church that is derelict, and he has a dream of this treasure, and then he goes searching for it. He makes that his aim, and his journey takes him to distant lands. He goes to the deserts of the Sahara deserts, and he goes through all kinds of adventures. And in the end, he discovers that the treasure that he was looking for was directly under the place where he was sleeping, in that derelict church.
Wow.
So that's what the experience has been for me. I started off with a very simple faith in Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura and his teachings, which I took at face value. Then I heard these various questions, questioning, is that, was he presenting something that's accurate? Is it authentic? There's always this impulse to try and find authenticity.
Right.
And
Yes.
then I went on this search, which took me to different places in India. I want to thank the Bhaktivedanta Research Center in Calcutta, an ISKCON project that is absolutely incredible. The work that they're doing allows us to access the original library of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, which Sundarananda Vidyavinod's family kindly gifted to Srila Bodhayan Maharaj, who then passed that over to the institute. So the journey has taken me, to South India, Sri Rangam, and so on, but it's led me back to the teachings of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. I know for certain now, following my research, that I can trust those teachings.
Wow. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Let's look at the comments section here. I actually can't go through them because there's too many comments. Krishna. Okay. I don't want to okay. Mukunda Prabhu always has some wonderful comments to make. I appreciate him. I'm actually going to bring him on the show.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so let's see what he's saying here.
Very, very learned Vaishnav, Mukunda.
Yes, yes. Let's see this. This looks kind of very technical, but we'll give it a shot. Is there a verse and or commentary that Gematri states that being Paramatmika Sishatva is pretty?
Yes, I'll send. I'll in the paper there will be quotations relating to that directly from the source, including all of those statements that the various moods of devotion and their different transformations and their different levels all come from Sheshatva. That also will be presented with source references and quotes. You know what I've done, Prabhu, is I have taken a selection of quotes from Sri Jamatri Muni, and then I also have quotes from Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura, and they match. They're like, it's just astonishing. They're saying exactly the same thing.
Right. Okay, from our friend Kishori Mohan. So what are we supposed to gather from this? It is inherent, but not present.
No, it's present. It's inherent. And okay, this comes back to it's an important question. There's a reason why the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya stress that everything in the state of perfection is found in some form in the jiva. And there's a reason that they say that, because a paradigm of Vedanta is that perfection in Vedanta is the removal of false designations and the reinstating of the self in his or her original position. That's a fundamental paradigm of Vedanta. If you say that the identity that we have in the spiritual world is not in any way connected to a fundamental attribute like Sheshatva, then you would be saying that we would be the only school, or one of the only schools of Vedanta, that teaches that we should reject false designations only to accept a new false designation in the state of perfection. False meaning something that's not connected to the soul, that's not intrinsic to the self, but that is aropita, superimposed. Anyway, this is a long conversation. I didn't want to actually go into this because I know that there will be some counter, some points in response to that. And, it's actually that in itself merits a lengthier discussion. The only point I want to make is that for the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya, it's very important as a matter of Vedanta, as a paradigm of Vedanta, to say that the state of perfection of the jiva is not something that is superimposed on the jiva, but is found in some form in the jiva.
Okay. This is a cool comment of clarification. Maybe we can talk about this. Now I understand the title. We're all agreeing on the philosophical issue, but Prabhu is taking objection to the fact that Bhaktivinoda Thakura changed anything, while essentially he didn't. That's right.
And I apologize if the title came across as combative, or some people may have read insinuations in it, and that was not intended.
I liked it because that's like clickbait for me. People want to click it, and that's why. Anyway, thank you for explaining.
I want to say I love Shama Sundar Prabu's image, the photo that he always has a really big smile.
Yes. Okay, here's a question from our friend Ravi, who also came on the podcast. How does this strong South Indian influence in terms of the source of Jiva Goswami's writings correlate with the Radha Krishna teachings that we feel that are the topmost teachings in terms of the ultimate source and object of love for the soul, when in South India this is not emphasized? I mean he means in Sri Vaishnavism.
It's a very interesting question. I've been looking at the writings, the beautiful poetry of the Alvars, and their poetry is just astonishing. So Nam Alvar in particular, and also Andal Alvar, they're expressing the moods of devotion of following the gopis of Vrindavan. So they speak about, I read a passage, I wondered whether it was coming from, whether it was not from the writings of Srila Rupa Goswami. It just beautiful, explaining the different types of meeting and different types of separation, and really expressing the mood of following, inspired by Srimad Bhagavatam and the gopis of Vrindavan. There are differences. One difference, of course, is that in the Sri Vaishnava tradition, Krishna's considered to be an avatar of Narayan. So the Sri Vaishnavas will, of course, still worship Sri Ram or Sri Narayan, Sri Krishna, Krishna in Braj, but they will consider that the ultimate source, if you want, the supreme personality of Godhead for them is Sri Narayan.
Right.
Another difference is that they do not have a service to Srimati Radhika. And another difference also is that they don't have a systematized exposition of rasa. So, discussion of sthai bhav, brahmachari bhav, and so on. That's something that's the unique contribution of Srila Rupa Goswami to our lineage.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see.
In response to Kishori Mohan Prabhu's question,
Yes.
He said, "Is it inherent but not present?" It's present, but it's present in an inherent form. But our svarup, according to Manavala Muni, I don't want to say what anyone, according to Manavala Muni, the svarup of the jiva is lost to the jiva at this time. Is the best way to express it. It's so lost that it even appears to be destroyed. And if you combine that with our tradition, that svarup, that nature, is we are able to remember it. You could even say we are gifted it by a Vaishnav.
Okay. Mukunda Prabhu again. What is mutually agreed is Swarup Shakti is not inherent in the Baddha Jiva. What would you say to that?
I have never seen. Well, I'm going to leave out that question. I'm not going to respond to it because for two reasons. One of them is that the Sri Vaishnav tradition, they speak about the jiva as being a Shakti, but they don't. I've not yet come across a detailed discussion of Swarup Shakti in the writings of Manavala Muni, so I can't comment on that.
Okay.
I also want to say that I don't have a wholly worked out theological solution that connects everything. I haven't done that work. I'm hoping that senior Vaishnavas might be interested in doing that. I have focused really in the study of religion and finding these sources and seeing what some of the implications are.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, the theology is another part of this. Okay, here's a question. This looks like from the devotees who are running the late B.G. Nrsimha Maharaj's Facebook. During his lifetime, Bhaktivinoda Thakura wrote about Jiva Tattva many times in his works. Do you think it would be correct to say that if his concept on Bhakti being inherent in the Jiva was so opposed to Gaudiya Siddhanta, his Diksha Guru and the Bhagnapara Goswamis would have corrected or rejected him? Also, was this same concept of Jiva Tattva something that the Bhangapara Goswami shared? I know that Vipina Vihari wrote a book called Dashamula Rasa, so I was... Oh, looks like it's cut off.
So it's great, really good question.
I'm going to take it off so we can see you.
In fact, the Bhagnapara Goswamis accorded the title of Bhaktivinod to Sri Kedarnath Datta for his literary contributions. So they would have looked at, they would have read the works of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura, especially, perhaps Krishna Samhita, certainly Datta Kaustuba, which was published quite a few years earlier. And in those books, he mentions, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura, that prema is the swarupa of the jiva. And they would not have accorded him the title Bhaktivinod if they objected to his writings. And Sri Vipin Bihari Goswami was deeply learned. I mean, if you look at he was prolific, the books that he wrote, real scholar. And we have no record of him objecting to Srila Bhaktivinod's explanation of the swarupa of the jiva.
Okay. It looks like we have Lalita Madhava also joined watching. Nice to see you, Prabhu. Where does the substantive distinction lie between the notion of the soul's dormant love, as in the inherent view, and that of the soul's potentiality to love, as in the bestowed view? when both are held to only manifest relative to certain external conditions, i.e., the mercy of the Vaishnava.
Mhm. Let me just read that one more time.
Sure, yeah. He's a great writer, great communicator.
Okay. Yeah, no, this is very important, very, very interesting point. So some say, and I don't, Padmanabh Swami hasn't mentioned this, but some actually say that where it says Jivadas Svarupoy Krishnera Nityadas,
Right.
they say that the Jiva is not eternally a servant of Krishna, but only has the potential to be a servant of Krishna. So they say that they want to add in the word yogyata, which means capacity. So they want to say Jivara Svaruphoi Krishneda Yogyata Nityadas. The Jiva has the capacity to be an eternal servant of Krishna. But now look at the Jiva. He or she is not a servant of Krishna. I'm using he and she for the Jiva. Grammatically, the Jiva is masculine. Chaitanya, Atman, and Jiva are masculine, but theologically feminine. So I'm just going to say one or the other. But so this idea that the Jiva has the capacity to be a servant of Krishna, Manavala Mamuni completely refutes that. He teaches that the Jiva is by nature a servant of Krishna now at this time, but that nature is lost to him. And so this is very interesting because it allows us to understand the teachings of Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami in the simplest way as he wrote them. So this conversation that we're having between about whether Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is consistent with Srila Jiva Goswami, that same discussion has been going on for a long time about the writings of Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami. People have been saying, well, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami is not concordant with Srila Jiva Goswami. And others have been saying, yes, he is. And they've been writing pages and pages on simple verses in Bengali that Kaviraj Goswami never intended to be explicated in pages. He intended his writings to be very easily understood by anyone. So, but now we're able to look at the writings of Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami and understand them in the way that in the simplest, easiest way to understand them, because they closely reflect what the original source, the way the original source expresses it. That servitude to Krishna, which includes prema, is not something that is merely a capacity. It's more than that. The soul is constructed for it. The raison d'être, the reason to be and the purpose and construction of the soul is to be an eternal servant of Krishna in prema. So it's not merely a capacity. A capacity is something where you can have the capacity to imagine I have a vessel, right?
Yeah.
I can fill this up. It has the capacity to fill nectar or to be filled with poison, right?
Yeah.
The same vessel. But that's not the case with the Jiva. The Jiva is constructed to have a relationship with Krishna in prema. He or she is built in that way. And how do we know that? And this is I'm quoting Manavala Mamuni here. He says, how do we know that? Because the Jiva attains full fulfillment upon attaining bhakti. When that nature, that bhakti nature is brought out, is probably a better way to express it, then the Jiva feels there's nothing more, or the soul feels there's nothing more that needs to be achieved or attained. One would not experience that if it was merely a capacity.
Right.
It's because the Jiva is constructed in that way, so the Jiva attains full fulfillment, or the Jiva attains his natural destiny, what he was made to be. That's what Sri Manavala Mamuni explains. Now, again, I've only completed 1 year of research on this topic, so
They have
I'm
five
still
to go.
looking onto it. Still
Right.
looking into it. I haven't submitted anything at this stage. Even this is like I'm sharing this because I was actually going to hold on to this for 6 years and then present it. And then I thought, well, that's often what people do. They do their research quietly, and then they write a book or something,
Right.
or you present your thesis. But I just, with the conversations that I've been having, that have been these various conversations and debates over this issue, I just felt that this is too important for our tradition for me to just sit on it. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to. It doesn't belong to me. I just present it to all of you, the Vaishnavas and Vaishnavis.
Sure.
And maybe it can be helpful.
Okay. Question here. Some say that Bhaktivinoda Thakur invented the region known as Tatashta. Can you speak on that? Do you know anything about that?
I've seen this particular debate.
This is another debate.
Well, no, it's related. It's related. People bring it up to show that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur was wrong, or I don't. Yeah, I've seen this come up. I haven't looked at it in detail. I can say that some Vaishnavas say that they say that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is just trying to explain it in a way that's simple and not to get too hung up on it. But I haven't looked at this in detail. This particular, it's just, I think it's one phrase, one sentence in Jiva Dharma. Perhaps it's found elsewhere as well, but it's not something that I've studied.
Right. Okay. There are many other questions here, but it's like going down rabbit holes, and just a lot of it. So one thing I want to say about the comment section is be very kind, be generous, be respectful when we're discussing this, because this is not meant to be really discussed on a Facebook thread, as Prabhu way in the beginning has established, but we're trying our best to explain things. And
I'm not able to see the comments. Are there lots of aggressive comments?
No. There's not at all. I don't see aggressive comments because it's a lot of people that I know, that I've interacted with online. It seems like there's a lot of appreciation also of the way this is being discussed and like that. So nothing really crazy.
I would like to reiterate the findings, the conclusions of the research. Work
Please.
that I've done so far, which is simply that whatever one's position may be on this particular question,
yes,
because there are clearly there are nuanced positions also, but there are basically there have been historically two positions on this, seemingly in conflict with each other. But whatever one's position is, this research, these findings, they establish three things. One, that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's presentation is not his own, it's not a figment of his imagination. It comes from a long and highly respected sastric commentarial tradition. Number two, we cannot say, knowing the source, that his presentation is apasiddhanta. That's collapsed. That claim is collapsed. And number three, to say that his presentation is discontinuous with the Caitanya Vaisnava tradition is really quite problematic. It's not anyone who wants to make that claim, they're in difficult. They have to deal with a lot of other issues. So it's not something that can be said very easily anymore. And I also want to just say that it's still early stages of the research, but you'll be able to see this paper, which has full source references and arguments, and many more arguments as well, and findings. This is really this is my first presentation on the topic. It's really just a snapshot.
I'm honored.
And if any of you are interested, come to the event on September the 18th. We'll discuss it further.
Will you post about it on Facebook for all the devotees?
I will
follow you on Facebook.
Yeah,
Let me
I
just
will do.
post. I was going to do this at the end, but we're coming close to the end, it seems. But if you want to follow Prabhu on Facebook, he goes by Simon Haas on Facebook, and you can get all the information that he's discussing right now about the paper, about the presentation, if you follow him on Facebook. So go ahead and give him a follow, a friend request, and all that stuff, and you'll be able to see it.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. Do you have any other additions to your conclusion there, Prabhu, that you want to add before we end?
Maybe I'll end with a verse from Padyavali that
Please.
really inspires me, and it's on the topic of debate.
Sure.
I'll utter the Sanskrit just because the composition is really beautiful.
Jai. Yes.
Navayang kavayo natarkika nacha vedanta nitanta paragaha nacha vadini varakaha param kapata bhira kishora kinkaraha. This is Padyavali 72, text 72, and Srila Rupa Goswami's work. And he's saying, this verse is saying, we are no poets or logicians. We have not crossed the vast ocean of Vedanta, and we certainly do not win debates. We are servants of a cheating coward boy. That verse was actually composed by Sri Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya.
Beautiful.
And you know how learned he was. He never lost a single debate except to Mahaprabhu or Krishna himself. But it encapsulates the mood of our tradition. We don't actually have a culture of debate. Sometimes we, as in Jiva Dharma, sometimes we have we may have to debate to try to protect our tradition in the way that we think is best. But it's always reluctantly and as a last resort, and it's not a modus operandi that through debate we can somehow discover Tattva Siddhanta. That's through Guru Shishyayo, through discussions between Guru and disciple.
Beautiful. Beautiful. It comes out in your mood and in the way you're speaking that this is the point. The point being that we have to do things according to Sadachar says so much about ourselves and about this whole thing, that we have studying Shastra and Siddhanta. What should the fruit of that be? The fruit of that should be we become more humble, we become more tolerant, we are seeing the unity in everyone. And I think, and thank you so much, Prabhu, for joining me and for doing this first discussion on this topic that you're going to do like a 6-year PhD on. And it was very brave of you to come to talk on this topic. And again, really grateful from deep within my heart.
Thank you so much, Namrasa Prabhu.
Yes, Hare Krishna. So if you want to get in touch with Sundar Gopal Prabhu again, check him out on Facebook. He will put up all his different things that he's doing. He also does, for those who weren't listening from the very beginning, check out this fantastic book, Yoga and the Dark Night of the Soul. This is Prabhu's book about his journey through, of how he found, his own Krishna consciousness through his journey, and also of how you can go through your own dark night of the soul. We all do, and so when I did the many that I've been through, this one really helped me. So come check that out as well. Sundar Gopal, please stay on. I'm going to turn off the live. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great rest of your evening.
Krishna, Hare Krishna.